Welcome to the Leo Training Podcast with Joe DeLeo. You'll hear in-depth interviews and tips from world-class athletes, coaches, and industry-leading experts to help you train smarter and improve at what you love to do. Train smarter, get stronger, move better, race faster. Here's your host, Joe DeLeo.
In episode 106 of the Leo Training Podcast, I sit down with USRowing sports performance dietitian Liz Fusco. Here are 3 things that you will learn when you listen to this interview with Liz. Number 1, principles that apply to the entire population of rowing for nutrition and diet. So we will share information that is applicable to the junior or high school population, collegiate, pre-elite, elite, masters, and para rowing populations. Number 2, you will learn some tactics and strategies for hydration and nutrition when you are traveling. And 3, we will drill down specifically and provide some very good guidelines and strategies for lightweight rowers to safely and intelligently make weight while also performing at their best. One final item before we roll to the interview with Liz. This interview will also be included in a special project that I have been working on for the past several months. I have been interviewing key members of the lightweight rowing community, and I will be announcing a special project, including the interviews and an ebook that I'm putting together with information of their experiences and things they've learned over their rowing career. And this project will be put on to probably a crowdfunding page, and money will be raised to support lightweight rowing and having it continue to be part of the Olympic program. Without further ado, let's roll to episode 106 with Liz Fusco. Good evening. Welcome to the Leo Training Podcast. I'm very pleased to be interviewing USRowing dietitian Liz Fusco. Liz, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy coaching and travel schedule to come onto the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
My honor. So we have got a action-packed interview in store for the rowing community. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's share a little bit about yourself, your background. Let's talk about your education and experience. You earned your degree at URI, Bachelor in Dietetics. So why don't you kick us off there and kind of take us through your professional experience as well?
Sure. Yeah, I kind of had a unique college experience in that I grew up pretty quickly, and I was certain by the time I turned about 14 that I wanted to be a registered dietitian. There were a couple of key members of my community that helped me realize that. There's someone's parent who came and talked to my 7th grade science class about nutrition. And that's when I realized that it was actually a legitimate profession and a science. And then, just by chance, my high school coach happened to be a registered dietitian as well. So I became pretty passionate about it early on, and I knew looking at colleges that I had to find a program that was what's called a didactic program in dietetics. So to become a registered dietitian, it's a nationally standardized undergraduate degree program. And I chose the University of Rhode Island because they focused a lot on science and research. I was really into the science fair in high school, so that's kind of what brought me there. And getting to the University of Rhode Island, I immediately immersed myself in the scientific community. So it started off by just carrying around papers from lab A to lab B. And then I graduated to entering data into a computer system and labeling tubes in the lab. Then I got to start sitting in on weekly lab meetings. I started preparing some of the foods that the lab was using in their research. And then I finally got to participate and first be a subject and then be in the background of a study that was happening on eating rate. So the lab that I worked in undergrad really focused on energy metabolism and how eating rate impacts energy balance. So we did some research in the lab there. the following summer, I did some research in the pedicabbers in Boston and Newport. I'm not sure if anyone listening to the podcast is familiar with the pedicabbers, but they're a unique population because they tend to not be active in the winter, and then they're very active all summer long. So they're a great population to study the effect of exercise. So we did some research on how pedicabbing impacts body composition, fitness levels, and energy balance in pedicabbers. The third research study that I did in my undergraduate degree was completely different population. It was obese postmenopausal women. And we practiced Tai Chi with them for 16 weeks. And we taught them what's called the DASH diet. It's the dietary approaches to stop hypertension. So I had all these really unique perspectives coming out of my undergraduate degree on the different realms of science that apply to not just the populations that you're studying, but just in the general sense. And I don't know if anybody else has studied nutrition or gotten a nutrition undergraduate degree, but I felt like coming out of that, I had a lot more questions than answers.
Yeah, that's a tough spot to be in, right? Because like clearly you have a very strong foundation and just spent the past 4 years doing a lot of research in the trenches, and then you got done and it was like, yes, I've learned a lot, but I just realized how vast this is. This is like huge.
And it was really overwhelming to me that everything kind of existed in this kind of shade of gray, that there was no kind of clear-cut answer. And I was really excited about that, but I was also kind of confused by it at the same time. And I felt like I needed to learn more in order to be a good dietitian.
So it sounds like you were really looking to try to gain some more clarity.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. And then be able to turn around and apply that and help the people that you're working with.
Truly. That's the important thing. How do you apply?
For sure. So from there, you take us to what led you to pursue your master's degree in exercise science and nutrition.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it really was that desire to be able to kind of pick a topic and run with it, to choose a specialty area, to really focus my energy and effort on something. And I feel like an undergraduate degree is a great structure, and it gives you, especially in nutrition, it is one of the most dynamic undergraduate degrees. You study chemistry, biochemistry, physiology and anatomy. You study statistics, psychology. There's food service, food safety, there's food science, there's medical nutrition therapy. It's a lot of information, and it's great to have all of that. But the next step is to figure out which one of those things you really care about and to run with that and to use that to become a specialist. And that's really what a master's degree is all about. So I decided to pursue a concurrent master's degree. So it was a dual master's program in exercise physiology and nutrition science at San Diego State University. Part of the reason why is that there weren't a lot of sports nutrition specific master's programs in the U.S. at the time. This was back in 2011, and I feel like it's grown a lot since then. There's still not a lot, but that's what kind of led me to that.
So it sounds like in some ways you sort of the dual degree concurrently, those two majors, you kind of shaped your own program a little bit. Is that accurate?
Yeah, definitely. And, rather than pursuing one master's, which is 1 year, the dual master's is actually 3 years long. So it really gives you the opportunity to establish a research question, put forth a proposal, go through the IRB review process, and conduct a full study with analysis and eventual publication. And that's what we did. It took a really long time. We actually just published it about 2 weeks ago.
No way.
But
oh man, wow.
Yeah,
well, tell us about it.
7 years. But
congratulations.
Yeah. So I did a lot when I was in grad school because I knew that I wanted to be competitive for the internship, which is the next step process to become a registered dietitian. You have to match to a clinical internship. I think the nationwide match rate's around 40%. But the ones that people want to go to are more like 1 to 10% match rates. So they're difficult to get into. So I knew I had to kind of fortify my resume, and I knew I had all these passions and things I wanted to learn. So I started by grading lab reports for food science, and then I became a teacher. So I taught food science for 2 years. And we were doing a lot of food preparation. It was really active environment for teaching. So that was really fun. I started an unpaid internship making nutrition labels at the Olympic Training Center in Chula Vista. And I did that for about 6 months. And well, I'm sure we'll get into that after we talk about grad school. I started and was co-awarded to be a primary investigator on a study which became this project that we just published, which was investigating the effects of a whole food versus a refined carbohydrate on a variety of different things, including glucose control, satiety, antioxidant status, and body composition in people who had metabolic syndrome, who were not on medications. So people who were kind of pre-diabetic, but weren't doing anything to treat their disease or disorder. So we looked at how the effect of carbohydrate snacks influenced their metabolism effectively.
Wow.
And I also waited tables.
When did you have time to sleep?
Rarely. It was a rough couple of years, but the cool thing about grad school is that even though you're pretty much exhausted the entire time, the idea is that what you're pursuing and studying and what this energy is going into is something that you really care about. So it's worth it.
No, it sounds incredible. So what are some of the things you learned out of that study? What was the conclusion? If you can share.
So we found a couple of things. So we were funded by Sunsweet, California Dried Plum Board. So we were looking at prunes, and we developed a muffin that was isocaloric, we call it. So it had the same calorie balance. And it was also macronutrient matched. So it had the same amount of carbohydrates, fats, protein, even the same sugar types when it came down to the carbohydrate. So the only difference was that the plums had antioxidants and fiber. And plums and other dried fruits actually naturally contain a little bit of sugar alcohol too. So my specific piece of the study was looking at the glucose responses to the food in an acute setting. So I had the subjects come in and I tested their blood glucose responses to a dose of either a muffin or prunes over a 2-hour time period. And then we had that same subject eat either the prunes or the muffins as a snack twice a day for 2 months. And then I measured their glucose responses to the food after 2 months. So the interesting thing that I found is that both foods, by incorporating carbohydrate snacks over a period of 2 months, in people who have pre-diabetes, remember, incorporating these carbohydrate foods actually improved their glucose responses to food over time, irrespective of the type of carbohydrate. So, and Elizabeth Parks, you guys can look this up. She's a fat researcher. She describes it as you best metabolize what you've just eaten. So by incorporating these small controlled portions over time, the subjects were actually able to better handle the glucose. Now, the caveat here is that regardless of time, the prune people needed less insulin than the muffin people in order to metabolize that glucose. So the bottom line of this kind of story is people who have diabetes don't need to fear carbohydrates. They should incorporate them. However, it may be more beneficial to choose a whole food versus a refined carbohydrate in that population.
Wow. I don't know a ton about nutrition, nowhere near compared to yourself, but just from what you're sharing, that sounds pretty groundbreaking, like some of the research, the findings. Is that accurate?
I think that it's not necessarily groundbreaking, but I think in our current atmosphere around food and which macronutrients are the bad guy, I think it can be surprising for people to hear that we've achieved those results, that we saw those results.
Right. That's a great point. Yeah. So it kind of shifts things back into the correct perspective, so to speak.
Yeah, it's not population specific that you best metabolize what you've just eaten.
Excellent. Excellent takeaway. Awesome. Okay. Wow. That is incredible. Since you've been working on that, you just finished 2 weeks ago. That was 7 years in the making.
Yeah, it was a long study. We screened over 400 people. It took a long time. We collected the data over almost 3 years. So yeah, and at the same time, I was kind of building up what I was doing in Chula Vista. So I started just by making nutrition labels, and then I started working on their social media and creating their Twitter and their Instagram feeds, kind of working on the development of that. We created a series of fact sheets. We had we have recipes on the website that I started, back in 2015. And now they're being taken over by the new batch of interns, which is really exciting to see the internship program grow there. And I started working with men's field hockey, actually was the first team that I worked with as a graduate student. And that was with a lot of input from my mentor, Sean Huglin. She was an incredible mentor. She really helped me understand how to approach evidence-based nutrition with an athletic population. So that was big.
Outstanding. Yeah. Outstanding. So you started with men's field hockey in Chula Vista. Eventually, obviously, you ended up with USRowing. Did you work with other teams in between that time period, and sort of what led you to work with USRowing?
Yeah. So dietetics is a long journey. So I finished with men's field hockey. I reapplied to the dietetic internship, matched to Houston, Texas. I moved to Texas and I worked within the hospital system there for 6 months. Passed my exam to become a registered dietitian. And then about 18 months before the Rio Olympic Games, I was hired as a contract employee for the endurance sports. So I worked with about 7 different teams, most of them endurance, a couple of them team sports because I was based in Chula Vista. And I started working with USRowing around April of 2015, I would say. So it was in the qualifying year, kind of a big time to show up. But I worked kind of closely with them more than the other sports, started to invest more time and energy into the rowers. And following the Olympic Games in Rio, I decided to take a full-time position with USRowing. So I've been focused on USRowing. I work a little bit on the side with USA Triathlon. But most of my effort goes towards USRowing and getting as many medals as we can and helping the athletes, perform their best.
Excellent. Very cool. Well, congratulations. That's awesome. Quite the journey. You've been sort of hop, skip, and jumping your way across the United States too. So, and as we are conducting the interview, you're packing and getting ready to head back from San Diego to Princeton across the country. So, well, hopefully at some point you'll get to be able to put your feet down in one spot for a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. We got a couple months before we start traveling for summer competitions. So we'll have a little time.
Awesome. Okay. Is there anything else that you would like to share about your background, your experience, education, kind of your journey up to this point before we sort of get more into diet nutrition for rowers?
I think talking about my background is probably the most uncomfortable part for me. So I would love to move on to some science.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So we will shift to part 2, diet and nutrition 101 for rowers. Okay. So, the audience that I have is pretty kind of eclectic. We got from juniors to high school, college, pre-elite, elite, and then masters, right? So, and I would even also include para rowing too. So we've got the entire kind of gamut. So as you respond, I think it would be helpful if there is potential different considerations for any of those populations or men and women. If you could note those, that'd be fantastic. So, What are some general principles and guidelines that all rowers can follow? And we'll just kind of start off with, first question or topic area to cover is what would be your guidelines for best practices for fueling pre and post practice?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the general guidelines that rowers can follow, most of the rowers that work with me are pretty familiar with my easy way to remember the main principles, which is the 5 R's. So the first R is rehydrate. So I think being hydrated is really important. It's an important thing for athletes to check off the list. That means going to the bathroom roughly every 2 hours that you're awake. P color is pale yellow, and it's moderate in volume. So if you're peeing more than once an hour and it's clear, you're going too hard. And if it's been more than 3 hours since you used the bathroom and it's dark, then you're probably dehydrated. So the second R is repair. So spacing protein intake out throughout the day, being sure to get enough to meet your needs, and choosing quality protein sources. The third R is to refuel with carbohydrate. Carbohydrate's your main source of energy. And I think one of the difficult things for all athletes, like weights and open weights alike, to understand is how to adjust your carbohydrate intake to meet the demands of different training days. That's a really challenging thing. That's a whole 2-hour-long podcast conversation in itself. Wow. The fourth R is to reinforce your immune function using healthy fats and colorful foods. That one's pretty self-explanatory. And then the fifth R, because I like to be repetitive, is repeat. These things should be happening throughout the day, not just at one meal, not just for one day, but over time.
Nice. I see what you did there. You built in some consistency with that last R, the repeat.
Yeah, and those principles apply to everyone, every population.
Excellent. Okay. So with that, how do we approach travel?
Actually, before we get into travel, I want to talk a little bit about fueling before and after practice, because I think that's kind of important. Okay. So again, for lightweights and heavyweights alike, sometimes your practice times can be kind of funky, like really early in the morning or at like 4 or 5 o'clock. And I think remembering to eat something in the hour or two before you start to train is really important. So, first thing in the morning, that's breakfast. Maybe the breakfast before your morning session's really simple. Maybe it's even something that's blended, not too high in fat, not too complicated or complex, something that you can digest quickly. That's the goal, in that time frame. And then for the afternoon practice, it's making sure that you, eat lunch. Because if you have a lunch break around any time between, if you're in high school or a junior, 10:30 in the morning, and, if somebody else, maybe they skip lunch or maybe it's at 1, there needs to be a solid lunch there. And depending on when that is, there might need to be another snack before practice, another snack before the snack before practice. So it's that distribution that's really key when you're talking about practice snacks. And if you're on the water for more than an hour, you should bring some carbohydrate with you, whether that's in the form of a sports drink, a little bit of low fiber dried fruit like dates or cranberries, or a sports food. But that's another kind of key thing. And that includes lightweights as well.
Excellent. What would be an example of early morning, simple breakfast, something that is going to not upset, the GI system in terms of, having to worry about like potentially throwing up during practice because it was too much. Right? Yeah.
So the two macronutrients that kind of slow digestion are, the two nutrients that slow digestion are, the first one's fat. It delays gastric emptying, so it actually holds food in your stomach for a longer period of time, which is awesome when you're recovering from exercise or in your main meals when you're trying to feel satiated, you want to feel satisfied for an extended period of time. Great. When it's an hour before you train, probably not the best time to consume large amounts of fat. because when you have food sitting in your stomach right before exercise, blood moves into your stomach to start digesting the food. And then you start to exercise, blood moves out to the surface of your skin, to your major organs. And there kind of becomes this tug of war over blood supply. And that's what can cause a lot of the GI issues and the cramping, or if you eat too high of fat right before a training session. And that's going to depend on the person completely. The other thing that can affect it is high fiber foods. So for some people, having a big bowl of oatmeal with nuts and dried fruit and coconut oil or butter or whatever mixed into it, for some people, they can totally tolerate that before a training session. For other people, that's too much because of those nutrients. So a simple breakfast option would be a smoothie, maybe with some type of a protein incorporated, like a whey protein or a Greek yogurt, or even just using a cow's milk or a soy milk as the base, and then adding 1 to 2 cups of fruit, and even as much as a tablespoon of a nut butter, like almond butter, wouldn't be over the top in terms of fat. That's going to depend on the person, like I said. It could be a pre-made smoothie. It could be, I have some athletes who have really sensitive stomachs and they have to swim early in the morning. So they will do rather than a hot oatmeal, they'll do a hot rice cereal. Mm-hmm. It's just something that's basically, you want it to be something that you know is going to be digested pretty quickly and that you can tolerate well. And I think the important thing for athletes to remember, in this process, if you're listening and you don't eat breakfast at all, you can start small. You can start by taking sips of juice, maybe a couple bites of a piece of fruit. Your gut is an athletic organ, and you can train it. It takes anywhere from 10 to 14 days. So over time, you can develop the ability to have a little bit more before your training sessions, and I guarantee you'll get a performance benefit from it.
I'm just writing that down because I like that quote. Your gut is an athletic organ, and you can train it. That's great.
True.
So one of the other key things too that you said there is that it's going to depend on sort of the individual. So it does sound like there's a little bit of sort of trial and error, a little bit of experimentation to sort of see how your body responds to certain foods, especially early in the morning. How you react may be vastly different than if it was at mid morning or lunch or something like that. So I'm just curious, is there, is that tied to anything specifically genetically, like why some individuals may be able to tolerate certain foods versus others? Or is it just,
Yeah.
Why?
It's a great question. I think to look at it from a really simplistic point of view first, if people habitually don't consume breakfast, and they habitually come out of their morning training sessions in a large calorie deficit, and they eat a really big second breakfast. That's a big rowing thing, right? Second breakfast. Then they're really full for a really long time. And maybe they're hungry. Maybe they have a small snack before afternoon practice. Maybe they don't. And then they come out of that evening practice and they're starving again. And they have most of their energy intake is happening at dinner and at second breakfast. So what happens is you wake up in the morning and you're still feeling a little bit full because your energy intake happened so late in the day. So I think a lot of it can be actually your intolerances to food can be related to how you're eating in terms of the frequency and the volume and the rate, how quickly you're eating too. Yeah. But of course, there's different, digestive issues that people have that can be more related to their individual metabolism. And that's where working with a registered dietitian, someone who's an expert in, being able to evaluate what certain triggers are causing what outcomes can be really helpful in figuring that out.
Excellent. Awesome. Very, very cool. Okay. We covered fueling before. Are we good with post-practice as well? Or do we not?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, the post-practice, I think it's really important. And it can be kind of a crazy time for a rower. You got to get your boat up there. You got to wash it, wipe it down, put it away, shower, change, maybe drive home. So thinking about that recovery snack is critical. In the first 30 minutes, let's say that you get off the water and you're at a training camp and all you have to do is put the boat away and go straight to a dining hall and you're going to eat within a half hour. If that's the case, having just a piece of fruit to hold you over, having just carbohydrate is fine. If you know it's going to be an hour before you eat, from when you finish exercise to when you get food in, that's when you should prioritize a recovery snack, especially if you're at an intensified period of training, aka you're doing multiple sessions a day or you're training a lot harder than you usually are. That can also be if you're training and also trying to juggle work and school and all these other things. Prioritizing that recovery snack is going to give your body what it needs precisely when it needs it. After exercise, there's this dilation of your blood vessels, and a lot of receptors move to the surface to pull in nutrients to start the recovery process, the repair process, to store glycogen. All of that happens in that timeline after exercise. So having that balanced recovery snack, being something that's a combined source of proteins and carbohydrates, and also some fats potentially, that's going to help accelerate that recovery process. For rowers, it's generally somewhere between 20 and 30 grams of protein. The smaller people, shorter people, lighter athletes will be closer to 20. Your open weight people that are really tall are going to be closer to 30, maybe even 35 grams of protein at a time. And then carbohydrate is generally based off of body weight. So you can pretty much say it's about a gram per pound half gram per pound of body weight.
Excellent. That is phenomenal information there. So what are some good examples of that, right? So say we got an hour to a meal. So like, for the high school athlete, from an education perspective, or a high school or college athlete, like what's something they can throw in their backpack?
A carton of milk and a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
Boom. Love it.
Done.
Is that the smooth peanut butter or is that the chunky?
Whatever tickles your fancy, children. If you're not into the chunky, go for the smooth.
Awesome.
Very cool. It could be a couple of pieces of string cheese, a couple strips of jerky, and a banana. It could be a smoothie. If you have one of those fancy, 24-hour keeps things cold. I have some athletes that will make a double batch smoothie and they'll have half of it before one session, the other half before the other. And you're kind of two birds with one stone there. A Greek yogurt tub with a little bit of granola and some fresh fruit on top. Another great example of a recovery snack. Doesn't have to be complicated. You also don't have to count it every single time unless you truly need to get granular, in which case you probably want to be working with somebody who can help you out there.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So interesting, just like kind of an observation on my end so far, a lot of the things that you're giving advice for in terms of food, right, or diet, like pre-practice or post-practice, a lot of them, you're just talking about simple whole foods. I haven't heard you say a gel, a goo, a powder. Like I heard you mention once, like, whey protein, like for the smoothie. But I haven't heard you say that yet. So that's just kind of interesting to hear so far on my end.
Yeah. I mean, it's taking the whole food approach is the way nature intended it, first off. And, the supplement industry is, I think we'll talk about this in a bit too, but it's a very sketchy industry and you only want to use things that contain what they say they do. Have been tested by a third party, because the FDA does not regulate supplements at all. Mm-hmm. Until somebody dies or gets hospitalized, they won't even look at it. And be sure that you're not wasting your money. So there's a very, very finite list of products that are worth talking about. And largely, no supplement is ever going to replace or be better than food.
Awesome. Excellent. Yes, we will be touching more on supplementation later. Okay, so Diet Nutrition 101. Next bullet point we had to cover was how do we approach travel, right? So whether we're a college athlete, high school athlete, international athlete, if we have a, either a bus or van ride or airplane travel, what are some things that we need to consider in terms of hydration, and then also fuel and how that's going to affect digestion and, during that time period?
Yeah, there's a couple of considerations for sure. The first would be, how far is the travel? What is your ability to be able to stop and use the bathroom? And how close to competition is it? As well as what is the means of travel? So on a bus, for example, if you are traveling for 4 or 5 hours and, the bus doesn't stop and there's no bathroom on the bus, then it's going to be kind of hard to be hydrated. If you're racing the next day, that's probably going to put you in a pretty bad situation. So I would suggest talking to staff member or coach and asking them to stop so that you can stay hydrated on the bus. So you can stop halfway. If you are flying, you lose about roughly 8 ounces of fluid per hour that you're in flight. So if you're just flying an hour, not a big deal. You don't really have to do anything. If you're flying to Plovdiv, Bulgaria, like we did last summer, staying hydrated and fueled throughout that, 18 hours of travel is more important, especially if you're going to be getting on the ground and the next day you have to unload and unpack a bunch of boats and rig a bunch of boats and spend the whole day outside in the heat. So it's thinking, those basic things, those 5 R's, trying to drink enough fluid while you're traveling that you're still using the bathroom about every 2 hours. And when you do use the bathroom, that your urine color is about a pale yellow color. So there's no need to be chugging fluid at any point in time in order to achieve this. It doesn't work anyways. Sipping on fluid is much more effective. But I think if we're talking specifically, and I've never had this happen before with lightweight rowers, but if you are doing a long flight and you only have 1 or 2 days before you have to weigh in, that specific situation might call for fluid restriction because there tends to be some sodium and fluid accumulation from flying. So that would be a situation where you might have to adjust your hydration practices and your rehydration practices in the days leading up to competition, if that's the scenario you're in. Now, usually we get somewhere and we have several weeks before racing, so we don't have to think about it. But I have had it happen in other sports in that specific scenario. But generally, if you basically drink about a cup of water for every hour that you're flying or traveling, and pay attention to those general markers of hydration. And remember that, eating frequency, eating every 3 to 4 hours, that shouldn't change whether you're training or not training. So when you're traveling, it's still important to have a meal or a snack every 3 to 4 hours over the course of the day.
Okay, so if we're traveling, is it better to try to bring your own self-prepared snacks rather than getting the meal on the airplane?
Great question. So I think airplane meals are slightly increasing in quality. Maybe I'm certain airplanes, or I don't know. But it's not going to completely destroy every hope and dream that you have to eat an airplane meal. That being said, a nice little insider tip: you can actually call the airline I think it's either 24 or 48 hours in advance, and you can request a special meal. So if you request a heart healthy meal, then it's one that tends to be lower in sodium. So especially if you're a lightweight doing an international flight and you're concerned about fluid accumulation, you could call the airline and request that heart healthy meal and have lower sodium snacks when you're flying. That's one way to limit the fluid accumulation that can happen in flight.
Wow. Excellent tip.
But definitely bring snacks, because if your flight's 13 hours long and they feed you once, and maybe they feed you breakfast and it's a sad looking croissant and some weird yogurt, it's really not quite cutting it. So you still want to pack things and make sure you don't get stuck.
For sure. Absolutely. And then is there any effects that athletes, rowers should be aware of when changing time zones in regards to the hydration or nutrition?
Yeah. So the time zone thing is, I will admit this is not my specialty, but it's something that I follow, and I work with some physiologists that have differing opinions and points of view on this. I think that there's no one size fits all approach when it comes to acclimating to a different time zone. Some athletes find a benefit to starting to change their body clock in the days leading up to travel. Other athletes find that it just impairs their sleep quality and causes them to struggle even more with acclimating to different time zones. So the strategy I'm referring to is, let's say you're going somewhere that is, 8 hours ahead. You would intentionally be staying up an hour later for 2 nights, and then 2 hours later for 2 nights, and basically trying to adjust when you fall asleep and when you wake up in anticipation of the travel, so that the overall time lapse will be shorter. So again, it's not my expertise area, but I know I have people in camps that say they've tried it and it doesn't work well for them, and others say they've tried it and it does. So unfortunately, still out on that one.
I'll just have to see how the body reacts. I might try that. That's interesting. Okay. All right. Those are some excellent and very thorough general principles and guidelines. And then we kind of got a little bit more specific around fueling pre and post practice, as well as also around travel. So do you have anything else that you'd like to add before we get even more niche and really kind of dive specifically into fueling for lightweight rowers?
Yeah, I think I'd just like to kind of close it off by saying that, all of these principles apply to all people, including lightweights. And although we're about to get pretty granular and talking specifically about lightweights, those same basic principles are always going to stand. Being hydrated, consuming protein throughout the day, adjusting carbohydrates to meet the demands of training, reducing inflammation and oxidative stress with anti-inflammatory foods, and practicing that day in and day out.
Excellent. And we're going to make sure we ask you some good anti-inflammatory foods. I love turmeric. I know that's good.
All of them, all the spices.
That's right. I actually got an awesome book on my bookshelf. It's called 50 Healing Spices. It's very good. Okay. Now, everything that we just covered in terms of those principles, travel, etc., getting more granular, would there be any differences or specific recommendations that you would make for lightweight rowers on those above questions that we just covered?
So I think lightweights have it tough. They have it tougher than the average person or the average athlete, because it is important for them to self-monitor and make sure that they're achieving the goals at the rate that they need to be achieving them at, but also that they're allowed to continue performing and improving in their performance over time. The granularity that's required in some cases can be overwhelming for people. So I don't think, and I'm sure this is something you all know, I think everyone's cut out to be a lightweight. I also think that there are people that are lightweights that probably shouldn't be.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think that understanding how to meet their energy demands at specific times is the most important thing for a lightweight to grasp, is to meet their needs in real time.
Got it. Meet their needs in real time. Okay. And is some of that just, it's going to come with experience and learning how their body responds to training, like whether it's a long endurance session at a lower intensity or, a higher intensity, whether it's threshold or speed work, what type, how hungry they get, what type of foods their body respond to.
Exactly. And this is when it's always helpful to work with someone who's a specialist in this case. But if there's a way to kind of understand how your energy expenditure is changing in different workouts, like how much energy you're expending in those shorter, higher intensity workouts versus the longer, more steady state workouts, and adjusting what your energy intake is before those sessions, during those sessions, and after those sessions based off of that.
Yes, I would definitely say we're getting some pretty nitty-gritty now.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at the basic, equation for energy expenditure, it's your resting metabolic rate, your resting metabolism, which basically only changes when your muscle mass changes. So when you gain muscle mass, you have an increased resting metabolic rate. Generally, when you're more active, you have a more increased metabolic rate. If you lose muscle mass, then your RMR tends to drop. But if anybody flips over a nutrition facts label and sees based off a 2,000 calorie diet, that's basically the RMR, resting metabolic rate. So your resting metabolism would be anywhere from 1,400 to 2,000 calories a day. And then you have your energy expenditure, your exercising energy expenditure. This is the thing that varies massively over the course of the day. Whether you have an off day or whether you have 3 hours of training that day, your exercising energy expenditure could be anywhere from a couple hundred calories just from walking around to several thousand calories. And the research has shown that elite rowers' energy expenditure ranges anywhere from 2,400 to around 7,200 calories per day.
Wow, that's a lot. 2,400 to 7,200 per day.
It might be a little bit shorter of a range or smaller of a range for lightweight rowers, because that paper was based off of open weight rowers. But the idea remains that the more energy you expend, the higher your caloric needs are. And that makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, common sense. That makes total sense for sure.
So then you've got these other two things that incorporate into total energy expenditure, which is the non-exercise activity. So walking around, maybe you have an active job, maybe you tap your feet, maybe you chew gum all day. And then you have the thermic effect of food, which is just a couple of % more added on. That's the cost of digestion. So the thermic effect of food is non-negotiable. You need that energy. Your exercising energy expenditure is also arguably non-negotiable. I mean, your body will eventually tell you to stop, but you will keep going even if you're in a large caloric deficit. So the problem that lightweights have, I think, is that they're not grasping their total energy expenditure. They're looking at just one small caloric number, and they're not realizing that, if you're expending 3,000 calories and you consume 2,500 to 2,800 calories, there still will be net weight loss at the end. So you still need to increase your energy intake, even when you're in a state when you're trying to become leaner.
Interesting. Okay. Which is a great segue to sort of our next question, which is, so as a lightweight rower, what's a framework that we can sort of set up to provide some guidelines, principles, again, to safely and effectively approach getting down to weight, right? Because we want to make sure this is good quality information, educational. We don't want people slashing weight in an unhealthy manner. So how would you advise an athlete to go about that?
Yeah. Well, step one is always going to be to get a baseline assessment. So again, I would highly encourage any of you to reach out to a local sports dietitian. You can go to scandpg.org. There's Find a Sports RD finder, so you can search through your geographic area and work with a specialist, because this is something that can quickly devolve, into not the most healthy or performance enhancing process. So getting a baseline assessment. tracking your weight in the most controlled means possible, which means not weighing yourself multiple times per day, because a lot of times, or all the time, the fluid and the foods that you consume are going to cause your weight to fluctuate from day to day or over the course of a day. So I like to have athletes weigh themselves preferably after a complete rest day. And it's preferably first thing in the morning after they've used the restroom, before they've eaten any food. And it's the same, ideally it's the same day of the week, and it's just once a week.
Okay.
When people weigh themselves every day, they see these big ups and downs, and it creates an emotional roller coaster that's not necessary.
So two really important points there is, so in terms of consistency, you're having them weigh once a week, trying to sort of standardize it at the same time of the day. When first thing when they wake up, after they've used the bathroom, but before they have, any food or anything like that. And then, the second thing you said is the psychological or the emotional effect it has if you're constantly stepping onto the scale. I'm sure there's some negative self-talk, that's going to kind of perpetuate into that. So from that standpoint, could you kind of tackle why it's important to make sure that, yes, you want to check in to make sure you're making good progress, but you don't want to sort of become, on the other end of the spectrum, obsessive about it in an unhealthy manner, and how that can be counterproductive?
I mean, like I said earlier, being a lightweight means understanding your real-time energy needs. And if you eat a meal, let's say it's a big salad, and you drink a bunch of water and there's a bunch of fiber in your meal, and then you hop on the scale and you're 3 pounds heavier, it's going to affect your real-time fueling. You may choose to eat less later in the day, or choose to skip a meal or a snack because you're weighing your salad in your belly. It's just not, it's not an evidence-based approach. And it definitely does not make the process any easier. When we talk about the goals for weight loss for a lightweight, it should be no more than a pound per week of weight loss, a half pound to 1 pound per week of weight loss, which means, if you are a taller, more muscular lightweight, you may need to give yourself several months in order to achieve that. And that's where having that baseline assessment, being able to monitor and check in with a specialist to make sure that you're achieving, what you're seeking, it becomes critically important for that. Now, if you sit at weight all year long because you are a quote unquote natural lightweight, then the focus for you is to make sure that you're having the best quality workouts possible. And training with quality means fueling with quality, which is the same basic principles of increasing your energy intake to meet the demands of harder training days, potentially fueling during those workouts, and prioritizing recovery afterwards.
Excellent. Okay. So to follow up on that, if we are so you did cite kind of an example there in your response that, you may have to be an athlete that plans several months out and sort of stair step gradually down to that weight. So let's use that as an example, because kind of as we were both prepping for this interview and stuff, kind of concurrently, the latest issue of Row 360 came out with a article within the magazine called Making Weight, and it specifically talked about lightweight rowing. So this is kind of a good tie-in there. So what are some approaches for an athlete that has to get down to that weight, and they're going to have to do it over several months? So they obviously can't take off several pounds overnight. They have to do it kind of methodically over 4, 5, 6 months. What would you advise that type of athlete to do? Would you have them keep a food journal?
Yeah. So I can count on one hand how many athletes I've had food journal.
Okay.
There are some very unique circumstances that might require it. Maybe there's something that's unexplainable that's happening. that we're trying to understand more, or maybe someone is having some digestive reactions. But I think that for lightweights, it's thinking about, like, again, I come back to the idea of kind of fueling in real time, which means consuming specifically higher carbohydrate meals and snacks before, during, and after your training sessions, and then sort of tapering your energy intake so that it's more focused on a quality serving of protein and vegetables with a small serving of a whole grain or higher fiber carbohydrate after you've recovered from your last training session. So, if you only have a session early in the morning, that might mean having a larger bowl of, a rice porridge or a smoothie that has juice as the base instead of water. Increasing your energy intake with the anticipation of having a really hard, really long workout. And then bringing fuel with you in the boat so that you can start fueling with carbohydrate, whether that be a sports food or a whole food, at around an hour to 75 minutes into those efforts. And then that also means having a higher carbohydrate, controlled amount of protein recovery meal. And then the rest of the day is when you can kind of pay attention to, first of all, timing, knowing you still need to be consuming food every 3 to 4 hours and making sure you're getting a good dose of protein, because protein is very satiating. It reduces your hunger hormones. So that's really, on top of the effects that it has on repairing muscle tissue and building lean mass and maintaining your metabolism. It also helps you feel full. And then incorporating some, healthy, colorful foods, things that have higher fiber content, and using that as your kind of snack options or meal options over the rest of the day.
Excellent. Awesome. Okay. Is there a way or are there signs or cues from an athlete's body so that they can identify and make sure that they're kind of hitting and making sure they get the proper macronutrient balance in their diet?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the signs of what is becoming known as relative energy deficiency in sport. The good thing about the signs for relative energy deficiency in sport is that you can feel them. You can observe them in yourself, and potentially in teammates. Although I wouldn't recommend that. I would recommend just focusing on the self. Some of the potential performance effects of underfueling are decreased muscle strength, decreased endurance performance, increased injury risk, decreased training response, impaired judgment, decreased coordination, decreased concentration, irritability, depression, and decreased glycogen stores. The health effects are, hold on, got them right here. It can affect your immune function, your gastrointestinal function, cardiovascular, psychological, growth and development, your blood or hematological parameters, your metabolism, endocrine function, so hormonal function, bone health, and menstrual function.
Wow. So a whole gamut there of things that could be affected well outside of performance net. We're touching on a lot of things that really are going to affect an individual's health and well-being for sure there. So, just being plain hangry or like Oscar the Grouch, there's a lot more to it than that. So you covered a litany of signs and sort of red flags to be aware of. So hopefully everybody kind of hits the rewind button and listens to that little section again. That was outstanding. Okay. Is there?
Yeah, pretty. And a lot of those things are glaringly obvious. So, is counting calories going to help with that? I honestly don't think so. Mm-hmm. I think it's more about understanding the macronutrients and listening to your body and giving yourself the time and the respect to do it in the most sensible way so that you can be the best athlete that you can when the time comes.
So I
think that there's this. Yeah.
No, I was going to ask
I was
you
going to say,
this.
it's really interesting culture.
Yeah.
I've seen it in boat houses. I've seen it at competitions where it's almost like, who had to cut the most weight in the least period of time? You know, like, I had to cut 8 pounds, and I'm like terrified, like turning red. I'm like, oh my gosh, you poor thing. And they're like, oh, I had to cut 9 pounds. And it's like, what, is this a trophy now? Like, is this something that people are like, what do you think? Is it something people are kind of like hold as a badge of honor, or?
Potentially. Yeah. I mean, we don't have any of that on the Portuguese team. Those guys are pretty dialed in, and
Yeah, I'm talking like not the national team athletes, but yeah.
Right. Yeah. I do. I think there's a little bit of. I sometimes wonder if social media kind of feeds into that. Like there's this gamification element of like trying to one up your teammate, and it becomes a competition, and sort of there's this total lack of awareness of that athlete. And it could be also a maturity thing depending on how old or young they are. And they just may not know, but, it was very interesting for me listening to all those, again, those warning signs that you're saying. And we are so sort of, wrapped up in our lives at times, or in our routine or our schedule or technology, that those things are happening and we just are not present. We don't even notice. And it just becomes sort of background noise.
Yeah. And I think that it's another thing that becomes culturally acceptable over time, even though it's not acceptable. Like, it's not healthy to not get a period. It's,
yes.
Menstrual cycles are a sign of health. And if your goal is to be a good athlete, then you need to be healthy. Recurring stress factors, same thing.
That's a great point. And I'm actually glad you brought that up, because I did have that down the list. So, but since you just brought it up, we should talk about that as well. So, that is probably a very legitimate concern for women, lightweight women, right? So do you want to speak to that? Like, yes, they should continue to have their menstrual cycle. That's not something I don't know. So what?
Yeah.
How would you advise them? What's the advice? What's the science say?
Generally, lack of menstrual cycle comes from under-consuming food, not consuming enough nutrients to meet your basic demands. So remember when I talked about your resting metabolism and your exercising energy expenditure, there's some things that are non-negotiable because your heart needs to pump, your lungs need to, help you breathe. Those things are an essential human process. So when someone is under consuming nutrients, the quote unquote non-essential human processes are going to slow down or stop, which means your menstrual function, your bone density, and your adaptations to training. Your protein metabolism can suffer too. So sometimes people find that their hair gets a lot thinner, or their nails get really brittle or stop growing. Those are all processes that, in theory, the human body could survive through for longer. And your body's in a starved state, so it's prioritizing certain processes over others.
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of building on some of those things you just touched upon, if an athlete say they were missing their period, how could that potentially kind of affect them if that happened for a long period of time? Like, would that potentially affect their long-term health or ability to have children later in life?
Absolutely. Yeah. It comes back to that whole kind of spectrums of things that I described earlier. It affects hematological function. So your iron status will likely be impaired at the same time. So your ability to carry oxygen, being an endurance athlete requires carrying a bit of oxygen. So That's one other side effect of low energy availability. The lack of menstrual cycle really means that there's not enough hormones, or there's a lack of hormonal balance. So when you don't have a lot of estrogen, it's difficult to conceive a child, obviously. Sex hormones are important for that. It's also very difficult to have all those metabolic processes that occur in the training adaptation process to happen normally. So you likely find that your performance starts to be stagnated. There also tends to actually be more storage of fat. Glycogen, water, and muscle protein tend to be lost. So it doesn't always result in the leanest athletes. And oftentimes it doesn't, because metabolic rate decreases when there's not enough calories available to support your life. So as the metabolism decreases, the body tries to hold on to what it can in order to survive.
Sure.
So there's all sorts of performance implications, health implications. The hormonal imbalance can also cause, and low calcium intake, of course, can cause the pulling of calcium from bone, because we need calcium in order for our muscles to contract, in order for our heart to contract. And if we don't eat it, then we're going to pull it from stores, including bone. And this is for male athletes as well. Just because they don't have a menstrual cycle doesn't mean that they have low energy that leads to low bone mineral density. So, as a lightweight male, especially someone who's not a natural sitting at weight lightweight, you should be getting your bone density measured every year to make sure that you have, healthy bone density.
And how would an athlete go about doing that?
So the machine's called a DEXA, or dual X-ray absorptiometry. And generally, many sports medicine clinics will have it. So if you have a sports physician, they will have access to it. So if you're a college student, then they may have a DEXA, or at least be able to send you to a hospital system that has one. And having that interpreted by a specialist is also important too.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Wow, that was fantastic. Very, very good information. Anything else to sort of add under that kind of question in terms of if you're ignoring these warning signs, sort of long term, the negative repercussions later in life to your health? Anything else to touch on besides don't do it?
It's thinking about the long-term implications, but also the short-term implications. Generally speaking, if you do basically a hack job of making weight, sometimes if you're a really talented athlete, you're genetically talented, your biomechanics are on point, sometimes you can get away with it for a little while. But when you work like I do in a system that operates on 4-year cycles, 1 year of good performance is not very helpful. And I would say the same to any high school or collegiate rowers. Do you really want to only be good for 1 year? Or do you want to learn how to do this the right way so that you can optimize your performance now and also not sacrifice your health later on?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's about the long term, the long game.
The long game. That's what rowing's all about.
That's right. Okay. So you already covered sort of lightweight and heavyweight, and you also touched on how the energy demands are different. So we already touched on that. Did you want to get more specific into certain strategies and tactics?
Yeah. So I think, a really important thing for a lightweight to do is to create a timeline. And if it's their first year making weight, then being a good note taker. I think athletes generally do a pretty good job of taking notes around their workouts. Also taking some notes about how you're feeling energetically during those workouts, and using that to kind of target back and tie back into your fueling practices. So there's that period of time when you're doing intensified training in the winter. You're coming down in weight in a chronic way, in a real, quote unquote, real way, actually coming down in weight. And one of the things that a lightweight should do is trial some different acute weight making strategies over the course of the off season, so that when they're in the competition season and they want to employ some acute weight making strategies, ideally they've already tried them, 10 to 20 or more times. When we talk about acute weight making strategies, those are any strategies that do not require a energy deficit or a calorie deficit and can lead to weight loss in that acute time frame before weigh-in.
Okay. Could you give me one example?
Sure. So one example would be low residue. Low residue or low fiber involves restricting higher fiber foods for the day or days leading up to competition. What this allows is basically the emptying of the GI tract. So you aren't pooping. You don't have any undigested material in your stomach. And by restricting fiber and emptying the stomach contents, an acute weight loss of anywhere from a half pound to up to 4 pounds can be achieved based off of the height and size of the GI tract.
Wow.
So that's one example. But obviously, it's a strategy that requires a little bit more meticulous thought and planning. Sure. And especially, with international competitions, if you're racing in other places and you need to be able to prepare your own food, if you're going out to eat a lot, it might not be the most practical approach. But it's an interesting one for sure.
Yeah, that's incredible. And that's a heck of a swing, a half to 4 pounds. It
totally depends on the person.
Yeah.
It depends, their habitual fiber intake. Right. So there's a lot of factors, and I know I keep saying this over and over, but that's why working with someone who's a specialist can be really helpful for that, because it gets confusing.
Absolutely.
Another approach can be either fluid restriction or sodium restriction. Again, this is one that needs to be done very carefully and preferably with help. But it's having a controlled amount of fluid or sodium over the course of the day to help reduce fluid accumulation. And there's obviously different approaches if you're practicing that in heat and humidity, or maybe you're not tapering before you weigh in. Probably not a great idea to fluid restrict. A lot of considerations with those ones. Wow. And then there's the good old fashioned sweat.
the one that we always see from, circa 1980s, 1990s, you're wearing a bunch of sweatpants, sweatshirt, towel around, kind of like Rocky running.
Please, no, please, nobody out there, do not wear a sweatsuit while you're coming down, unless it's only for like 10 or 20 minutes. But even then, there's so many different ways to sweat. I think I've seen some interesting things that I wouldn't recommend to anyone, not even my worst enemies. I think the most approachable, safe ways to go about this are laying in a warm bath. So if you have a hotel room and you have a tub in your hotel and it can get to a certain temperature, or you can lay in a hot tub, that's one potential approach. But again, you have to know the temperature of the water. You have to track the amount of time that you're in the water. You have to know that where you're racing is going to have a tub and that it can get to that temperature. So that can be complicated. Sauna, same thing, can be helpful, but is it going to be there when you're racing? Obviously, just wearing a windbreaker and doing a warm up on an erg, many people will lose a pound or two just in their warm up. So thinking about that and potentially incorporating that into the weight making strategy. Ultimately, if sweating is part of your weight making process, you should not be sweating out more than 2% of your body weight.
Right, because if we have more than 2%, we know that we have loss in performance.
Well, it's really that, in not in high school racing, but in the elite world, in collegiate lightweight events, or not even in collegiate. I think collegiate, the weigh-in's the night before, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in events in which you only have 2 hours to rehydrate before your race, that's not enough time to rehydrate if you are significantly dehydrated. And what we know about the effect of hydration on performance is the most critical thing is showing up hydrated, showing up at the start line hydrated. So it's not so much what you lose in a 2K that's going to affect the last 10 seconds. It's, are you showing up like on the line hydrated? And I think, there's an interesting little anecdote of this. When we were in Sarasota in 2017 for the World Championships, it was extremely hot and humid there. And where the boats launched was 25 minutes from where the start blocks were. So they were launching and already starting to sweat a ton. By the time they get to the start, they do their warm up and get to the start blocks. Some of them have sweat a significant amount. So we were actually freezing water bottles and putting them in the boat with them so that they could drink water during their warm up so that they could start those races hydrated.
Wow. So not only making sure you're hydrated, but you have to take into consideration the weather, the factors, the venue, how long it's going to take to get from the start blocks to the start line, or the warm up, excuse me.
How long it's going to take for you to get from the hotel room to the venue for weigh-in. It's another thing to think about.
So many little details to worry about. Wow. So
it really helps to have a solid plan, my friends.
Yes. And for you, because it's not like you're just working with one person, right? So
no.
So on your end, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like a ton of what you're doing is there's a plan in place, and I'm sure it probably gets a little bit individualized for some of the athletes, but a huge chunk of what you're doing is really continuing to educate and have a very strong framework in place for all of the athletes and making sure they understand and they have good habits. There's a good, consistent routine formed.
Yeah. I think we're fortunate in that nutrition is not rocket science. I think that oftentimes people try to overcomplicate something that doesn't need to be as complicated as it might seem. And I think that there's a lot of reasons why that is. It's a very beneficial industry money-wise. So, I think a lot of nutrition things are intentionally confusing. But the basics always work. And what I generally try to do is help athletes to kind of check it off of their list of things that they have to worry about or think about, get out of their own way in terms of that. Just know the basics, understand the signs and how it feels to be compromised, and understand how it feels to do things the right way, and to kind of use that intuition to guide their training and their nutrition practices.
Outstanding. Okay, so that took us through all the topics you and I had down. And then what I did was I wrote some bullet points, some questions from that Row 360 article, because they had some good kind of points in there for us to touch upon. And probably one at the beginning here, and you've already kind of done a great job of touching on this, but we'll get a little bit more granular on it. So are lightweight rowers or lightweight rowing athletes more predisposed to rib injuries due to decreased bone mineral density? And if so, what other factors do lightweight athletes have to be more aware of due to their dietary and weight constraints?
Yeah, and I really want to approach this in the most balanced perspective, because I think if I was looking at it solely from a nutrition perspective, I'd say, of course, inadequate calcium intake, inadequate energy intake is going to place extra stress on the body, which is going to lend a rib to fracture. And yes, those things are true. However, I think that the true source of a rib stress fracture is biomechanical in nature. So, does it have to do with your rowing stroke? Does it have to do with the amount of erging that you're doing? Are you rowing in open water when there's a crosswind and it's really breezy? Are you switching from port to starboard? Are you sculling for the first time? All of those things are really important considerations for what's causing the rib stress fracture. But I will say that as a lightweight, if you are not practicing weight making in the most health-based way, and you are restricting large food groups, or you're restricting the energy to an extreme, you will have a demineralization of bone occurring. The extent of that is going to vary based off of the person, of course, based off of all those other factors that I mentioned. But you will have an increased risk of contracting a rib stress fracture if you're not consuming enough.
Wow. Okay. So again, another reason why it's so important to make sure that we're having a well-balanced diet and making sure we're tackling all the food groups, all the vitamins, all the minerals.
And specifically increasing your carbohydrate intake to meet the demands of training. That's the really big one. That's the one that shifts the most in terms of, the total composition of your plate. And if anybody wants like a good visual for this, like what it might look like for an easy day of training plate, or maybe an evening weight management plate versus moderate training when you're doing several hours a day, or hard training days when you're doing 3 or more hours of training every day, you can go to teamusa.org/nutrition and check out our athlete plates. They are like a nice little visual for what a plate might look like.
Cool. I'll put that in the show notes. teamusa.org/nutrition plates.
Mm-hmm. Just nutrition, actually.
Oh, sorry. Just nutrition. Okay. Okay. So do you agree that in the off season for lightweight athletes, women should be at roughly 60 to 63 kilogram and men 74 to 76 kilogram? So for reference, the women have to weigh in at 59 kilogram, crew average of 57 kilogram, men 72 and a half, crew average of 70 kilogram. So that's about a half a kilogram loss per week when they're trying to get down to weight.
Yep, I agree with the 1/4 to 1/2 a kilogram loss per week, so no more than a pound per week. And the general rule of thumb is, and I checked the math and this kind of lines up pretty closely, that lightweights or weight making athletes in general, so that's like wrestling and all the other weight makers, should increase about 5 to 8% above competition weight in the off season. So 5 to 8% above their race weight. So that range sounds appropriate. I think that this also gets back to the ultimate question of, should you be a lightweight? If you don't sit in that range, if you're 15 or 20 pounds above it, why are you doing this?
Right. Yeah. And that's going back to the health part.
Right.
Okay.
And there are, those isolated people where they just, one of the things you can look at is the CDC growth charts. So for junior lightweights, for example, that's what I recommend in establishing whether or not they should even consider being a lightweight, or maybe whether they need to. This is the other thing with junior lightweights. They may need to move into an open weight category because they're growing humans. That goes with college lightweights too. If your body type is that, and it's been that for your entire life, then it might be a slightly different story. But the general rule of thumb is 5 to 8% above race weight in the off season. Yeah.
Okay. And would you say that's being 5 to 7% above race weight? That's actually a healthy thing to not be at race weight year round, right? You're kind of allowing your body to take a break, so to speak.
Yeah, especially if you have to work your way down to race weight and kind of achieve that number, it's important to put mass back on in the off season, because that's going to allow you to train with quality. It's going to allow your body to be able to handle the demands of training a lot better than trying to maintain a number all year long. And that goes back to calcium metabolism, bone mineral density. That goes back to hormones, menstrual function, all the psychological impacts of all these things. It kind of ties all those different low energy availability symptoms back in.
Very cool. Excellent. So last thing we got to touch on, make sure we don't forget this, supplements.
Yeah. So, like I said before, no supplement is ever going to replace or be better than food. And, establishing a good solid foundation and a weight making strategy is critical. And a supplement will never replace that. There is a select list of things that have been shown to aid in either training quality or performance in rowers. And I can list them all off right now. It's whey protein, sports foods like carbohydrate foods, sports drinks. It is caffeine, beta-alanine,
coffee,
nitrates, and creatine and sodium bicarbonate. The Australian Institute for Sport just released their most recent classification system for sports supplements. And those products that I just mentioned are listed in their Group A supplements, which means that there's evidence of a performance benefit in specific situations, that there is a safe, tested source available, and that it doesn't violate the nature of Olympic sport. So no cheaters.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So that was actually going to be my next question. So because, especially for athletes, and as you said earlier in the interview, that supplements are not regulated by the FDA, which means that anybody can put anything into them and it's not actually verified or checked. So it's super, super important, especially for athletes competing, especially at the international level, but definitely at any level, that potentially may be drug tested, that they are taking supplements that are not going to cause a positive test. So again, I know you just said where are the resources that they can check for approved supplements?
Yeah. So first off, I have a one-step process when it comes to validating a supplement. Step one, does it have an NSF for sport certification or an informed choice certification? If the answer is yes, then I'll look at it. If the answer is no, then it's not worth taking. So the National Safety Foundation and Informed Choice are the two third-party testing agencies that have the most stringent process. The National Safety Foundation, or NSF, being the number one. So they not only do they test for banned substances, but they test for metabolites. And they have a lab where they're actually trying to synthesize new metabolites before supplement companies can hide them in products. So they're very, very thorough, and they test every single batch. So if you want to check and see if a product is safe, I would recommend searching nsfsport.com, and they have a database, and they can tell you when a product is certified. And likely you'll see the NSF for sport logo on the bottle, because it's a very expensive testing process. The supplement company that we use and trust is Thorne. Thorne actually manufactures a lot of their supplements in-house. They do their own, well, they call it third-party testing, but I guess it would be second-party testing. And then they also send it to the National Safety Foundation for third-party testing. And they test everything down to the top levels. Wow. Yeah, so they do both. Yeah. And they also possess a couple of patents for products like beta-alanine. So it's the primary product. It used to be Power Bar, actually, and now it's Thorne beta-alanine. And anyone listening to this podcast can get 10% off of any Thorne products with the code USAROW10.
Awesome.
But honestly, plug or no plug, their products have helped us a lot over the years, and it feels really good, and it's good for the athletes to be using products that they know are safe.
Fantastic. Yeah, and that's key right there. Not only, of course, something they can take that'll help them, but that they're safe and isn't going to cause a detriment to them. So that's super, super important. And clearly they make a huge effort to make sure they're very thorough in getting everything verified, both in-house and out of house. That they're
Yep.
Excellent.
And even then, some supplements work for some people some of the time. Most supplements don't work for most people most of the time. I think that's a Ron Mon quote, if I'm not mistaken. These things need to be employed in specific doses at specific times of year, phases of training, and really should be done in conjunction with a sports scientist who really knows how to implement these things. One of the things I see a lot is like quote unquote pre-workouts that just contain some caffeine and some amino acids and some branch chains and some beta alanine. And it's like, well, caffeine is a specific dosing strategy. Branch chain amino acids are in chicken. And beta alanine is also a really specific dosing strategy. That's a chronic dosing strategy. So if all of those things are mixed up into one little powder, you don't know how much of any of that is actually in the powder. Some of it can sink, different things are heavier or lighter than others. So the top scoops might have more caffeine than the bottom scoops. And if you see a little long plus sign on the back and it says proprietary blend, it literally means that they don't know how much is in there.
That's not good. That
Yeah.
doesn't give me confidence. That's not good. But that's excellent for the audience to know what quote unquote proprietary blend means. Now,
Yeah.
excellent. Well, that takes us through every question and topic that we had down tonight. We are now approaching just under 90 minutes. So, Liz, thank you so much. This was incredibly informative and just a very knowledge bomb-filled episode of information. So, thank you very much for taking the time.
It's like already an hour and a half went by, and I feel like we could spend an hour just talking about one of the sports supplements that I just mentioned. So
we definitely could, and I will probably have to have you back on.
Well, I would love to be back on. Thanks for having me. This has been fun getting all the science out.
Yes, absolutely, and my pleasure. So just hang on the line. Let me give you a proper goodbye off air, and we'll wrap it up.
Thanks for listening to the Leo Training Podcast. Subscribe and get even more expert training tips at www.leotraining.io.